Chasso Viola Shovah Case Montier, better known simply as O Shovah to his kin, or Commander Farsight to the Imperium of Man, is possibly the most divisive Tau commander of all time. He was once the greatest hero of the Tau Empire, but now he is a renegade amongst his brethren, who rejected both the Ethereals and the greater good to lead the breakaway Farsight Enclaves. He is the master of Mont-Ka, slayer of orcs beyond counting, and one of the few Tau to advocate melee combat as a viable method of war. This is the first part of his tale, recounting his rise to greatness. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. Farsight's journey began upon the Sept world of Viola, his homeworld. His rise through the ranks began in the training domes of Montier. As was protocol for a young member of the warrior caste, better known as the fire caste, he was enrolled in the planet's junior academies pretty much as soon as he could walk. In his studies, he established himself as a serious yet dedicated aspirant with a voracious aptitude for information. His peers were gifted too, but the young Sho had a spark of brilliance that stood out from every other Tau of his generation. Within days, his tutors knew they had more than a simple fire warrior on their hands. Even in his youth, he was fiercely independent. Within his first Tau seer of basic tutelage, he had mounted several fact-finding raids into the enrollment centres of the Montier training academies, so basically he went snooping. When the warrior and his training mates were finally cornered, he puffed out his chest and demanded that he was taught the Code of Fire, which is one of the main training steps for fire warriors. The first 3 times this occurred, he was punished. On the 4th, the weary tutors gave up, and he was taken into the Battle Dome program. He was accepted a full 3 years before his enrollment was due to take place. With this act, the warrior who would become O Shovah had set foot on the path that would bring several wars, bitter and costly ones, to the Tau race, almost destroying the greater good once and for all. Even before he was known as Shovah, which is the Tau word for Farsight, the young Violan's martial temperament was the subject of much discussion amongst the masters. His physical skills were well above average, and they'd been told by high command to expect as much. Accidents of birth are indeed rare in Tau society. But what was truly remarkable was his ability to retain information, tremendous amounts of data from every situation he encountered. The aspiring fire warrior absorbed and memorized every facet of the training academies he witnessed, whether it concerned texts, environment, rivals, weapons, the battle dome's warzone simulations, or the rules that govern them. He could recite every volume of the sacred Code of Fire, the main teaching point for Tau, from end to end, and he took a quiet delight in violently demonstrating its physical principles to any who challenged him from his students. He even deciphered the combat codes and signals used by his superiors, taking advantage of this to monitor their secret communiques whenever they were careless enough to employ them in his presence. His ability to use the knowledge he gained from every experience to assess and predict the actions of those around him was unnerving, and earned him the nickname Sho, which means inner light in the Tau tongue. Despite being several years younger than most other Tau, his memory and fierce determination earned him a string of perfect scores in the simulations. Training sessions became the highlight of his daily life. Whenever he was thrust into the warscapes engineered by his tutors, he would find cover, assess his environment and resources, and then lead his team in performing the exact set of maneuvers necessary to complete his allotted task in as efficient a fashion as possible. His casualty count was so low as to be unprecedented, and he escaped being tagged by hostile sim ghosts every single time, even in the infamous jungle of 1,000 eyes. At the time of his graduation to the Firecast, the legendary commander Puretide was still making a point of personally initiating as many new recruits into the ranks as possible. The famous commander, a legend among the Tau, was on military business in Viola when Sho's generation were inducted, and to the great pleasure of Montier's warriors, he agreed to take part. Amidst much bowing and scraping, the Montier Academy's tutors told Puretide of Sho, the first warrior to have been enrolled at such a young age. As Puretide bestowed the rank of Shasla upon the Tau prodigy, he asked how he could consistently second-guess even the most devious of traps and scenarios that his tutors could set. The young Tau politely explained. He usually thought of what plans he would set if he were a tutor, and then worked to disable them. Meaningful glances were exchanged, but nothing more was said on the matter at the time. 2 Rotar later, which I'm assuming is a month or some form of Tau timekeeping system, the tutors who had overseen his generation had been relieved of their duties and sent back to the front lines. Sho and his fellow initiates were sent to the same war zone, fully inducted into the Firecast and eager to take the field against the Arakan incursions of the Western Vale. Behind closed doors, Puretide and his aides discussed the fact that Sho's acumen and prowess were as promising as they had hoped, yet the true tests, those of the spirit, not the mind, were yet to come. Shas'la's Sho made a great impact upon the military spirit of the Violan Firecast in the Vale. As was procedure, he served the first 4 years of his career as a member of a Fire Warrior team in a Hunter cadre. However, his former tutors had old allies among the command structures, warriors from their own generation. One in particular, the fierce Sharkan Thas, had not taken kindly to the young aspirant making his exercises look foolish. He ensured his former pupil was posted to the fiercest war zones, and that Sho was always right on the front line. If he was truly born for glory, a true prodigy, he would rise to the challenge and prevail for the greater good. If he fell, so be it. The whole issue of the Montir domes would become a distant memory before too long. However, the young Tau proved more than capable during the ongoing purges of the Arakan race. En route, Sho memorized every facet that the Watercast had been able to glean in their dealings with the female Ostromystics of that many-legged race. Information the diplomats had carefully hoarded and sent to the Firecast on the same day the Arakan had formally refused to join the greater good. Before his team had even fired a single shot, Sho had thoroughly analysed the Arakan's blade-legged male gender and their battle doctrine, coming to understand their abilities nearly as thoroughly as he did his own. During his 4 years as a Shas'la trooper, or a frontline basic fire warrior as you and I would know them, Sho became known to every warrior in his cadre. His ability to wield a pulse rifle at close range saw him drive back several surprise attacks, and he was always quick to push home any advantage he could. He quickly earned the trust of his senior officer, and later his respect. This turned to eternal gratitude at the Battle of the Great Web, where he set the Shas'wi free of a tangle clutch trap, saving him from the egg sacs of the Ostromystics and the horrific death that would otherwise have followed. Eesh, that's going to be hard to pronounce if that keeps coming up. By the end of his tenure, it was Sho's suggestions that formed the vast majority of battle plans for his unit. As a firm believer in the greater good, Shas'wi Monoka recommended his charges for their first trial by fire at the earliest opportunity. This is the first trial that the Tau take in order to progress from Shas'la to Shas'wi, which allows you to pilot a battlesuit. Before long, the young Tau warrior and his team were back on Viola for potential promotion. The trial by fire is a traumatic experience. It is normal for a high-level adversity in these coming-of-age tests for the warrior caste. But there were those at the training academy that remembered Sho's inadvertent hand in the fall of their old colleagues and wished to push him even harder for it. He was thrust into a pitch-black, live-fire war dome where he and his team were assailed by numerous nameless horrors that defied any understanding. Even Sho's wits were of limited use, and in the end, the fire in his soul secured his fate. When a tentacled thing came whirring down to chew his Shas'wi apart, Sho threw himself into its path and was cut to ribbons in that process. The Tau warrior died that day, and not from the last time. When he was brought back from his simular coma, his tutors informed him that only those of his team who had died in the ordeal had passed, and that his new rank was that of Shas'wi. When Sho asked after those who did not pass, however, his question was met only with stony silence. Honestly, I think it's best he didn't know. Though a hidden part of his soul railed at this, Sho's gladness at being alive and the fulfillment of his most fervent desire temporarily drowned out any more questions he had. After all, with the rank of Shas'wi came the honour to pilot a battlesuit. Sho returned to the Western Vale to garner experience as the Shas'wi or sergeant of a fire warrior squad, but it was less than a full cycle before he was inducted into the armoured elite of the Tau armies. His masters were as curious as he as to whether his tactical acumen and military flair would work in battlesuit command. They weren't disappointed. Unfortunately, Sho was. Whilst analysing drone-captured footage of his time as a fire warrior, his Violan masters had noticed a marked affinity, even desire, for close action in his tactics. The Firecast commanders who monitored his progress wanted to teach him the self-control and perspective of a support role. On the day he reported for duty to Chassar Toll High Command, he was assigned to a broadside team. It was under the auspices of veteran rifleman Chasseur Oblotai that Sho learned the basics of Battlesuit command and a measure of restraint in the process. At first, he was privately crestfallen. He always wanted to pilot a crisis battlesuit, but he hid it well. But in his heart, he knew the war effort was greater than his own personal desires. He applied every part of his mind to mastering the XV-88 broadside, drinking in data and after-action report with every waking hour outside the piloting matrix of the suit. Within a training cycle, he was getting more range and accuracy out of his heavy rail rifle than Chasseur Oblotai himself, which is a bit ridiculous. As soon as the programs had been observed, Oblotai's support cadre was dispatched to the Vale. There, as they blew apart one huge-bellied extremistic after another, he earned himself a new epithet, the Young Executioner. Though only his mentor picked up on it, the 4 years fighting at the rear of the Hunter cadre's efforts were the most trying times for Sho in his life so far. To be armed and armoured in the height of offensive technology and have to rely on younger, more lightly armoured warriors to fight in his stead, this was a torture Sho never wished to repeat. 4 years and 1 trial by fire later, Sho earned his wish. Because he'd served long enough and with enough distinction to earn the rank of Chasseur, he was entrusted the command of a cutting-edge XV-8 crisis battlesuit. He was expected to master it quickly, for Commander Dawnstone herself was about to lead the warriors of Viola in the final actions of the war and needed the best troops the planet could provide at her side. A period of exceptionally bloody battle soon unfolded, scarring Sho both physically and mentally. He lost most of his left leg to a skittling swarm that got inside his armour, and saw many trusted comrades meet spectacularly visceral ends. However, his agility and skill at the helm of the XV-8 quickly became famous among Dawnstone's command. He was promoted to Saznami, taking his place alongside one of his old tutors as a close protection officer, an XV-8 bodyguard for his commander. He repaid the faith tenfold during the engagement with the Arakan Trinity at the heart of the war effort. He led his commander to the silken heart of the Arakan Cocoon ship, where he and Commander Dawnstone launched the Montkar, or killing blow, strike that killed all 3 of this much-feared Trinity, expelling the Arakan from the Western Vale once and for all. En route to Viola, however, tragedy struck. Whilst docked with the Cocoon ship, Dawnstone's flagship had been infested with Arakan skittlings that poured out of the vents and conduits. Perhaps intended as a last gesture of defiance, the infestation fell upon the Fire Warrior Command Council whilst they were engaged in debate, catching them unarmed and dressed only in their fatigues rather than their armour. Sho held back the swarm, using his body to block the doorway, while his commander and her aides escaped. Sho stood firm even as agony coursed through, the venom tusks of the skittlings piercing his skin again and again until his frame shook its last. Sho awoke in a medbay, with the familiar sounds of Battle Dome Montir visible outside. His body was covered in psychosomatic welts, but no permanent harm had been done. Dawnstone herself was by his bedside to inform him that the skittling attack had been a trial by fire. The whole event was simply a simulation. Just as she had hoped, Sho had excelled as a bodyguard, even without his battlesuit to rely on. In light of this, he had been promoted to Chassel, a commander in training, and he had succeeded in his duties with such flying colours that the venerable Commander Puretide himself had agreed to train him in the arts of war. Sho was transported to Dalith Prime, where he made his way to the peak of Mount Kanji, seat of Puretide's tutelage. With only his wits and tenacity, the journey up the mountainside was a gruelling test in itself. Yet by using a system of improvised pulleys and the dead weight of a Kanjian snow lynx he had killed with a makeshift slingshot, Sho made the journey up the face of the mountain, mile by painstaking mile. Soon after he reached the peak, Sho found Commander Puretide deep in meditation. The hermit was cross-legged in a simple hover throne. His ancient frame had atrophied, but an unyielding dignity shone nonetheless. Sho had heard the sage had been crippled by a spinal injury whilst expecting the colonies on the other side of the Damocles Gulf, but was polite enough to not ask. He was there for wisdom, not a sparring partner. However, the teammates he was to compete with atop Mount Kanji would shape his fate for many years into the future. Seated in meditation in front of Puretide were two young Tau warriors. One introduced herself as Shovah, a fellow aspirant to the command ranks of the Fire Caste, and the other a taciturn but gifted young warrior known as Case. Shovah would go on to become Commander Shadowsun, and Case would find fame in the video games, Fire Warrior, and Dawn of War. Through the hardships that were to follow, the three aspirants became as close as a Talisera bondmates, albeit one engaged in a bitter rivalry for the approval of their elderly master. Each of Puretide's students had a different style of war and a separate philosophy to go with it. Shovah's passion and desire for fires of battle saw him gravitate toward the Monk Ka, or killing blow, while Shovah was careful and meticulous, a practitioner of the patient hunter Cao Yon. Case, a withdrawn and strange individual, was unusual. He sought mastery of the Monad's way of war. His situation was to become the perfect lone warrior, an army of one that could triumph with only the materials to hand, no matter what. Though Sho scored highest in training simulations on many occasions, his peers weren't far behind. The competition saw each strive for success just as hard as in any true war zone, and earned the respect of their fellow students in the process. Commander Puretide had long ago mastered every one of the Tau's martial disciplines, and more. Over the years he honed the abilities of his students to near superhuman levels, all the while striving to make them appreciate the alternate strategies available to the wise. When each was asked to fight in the manner of one of their peers, for example asking Farsight to fight as a Monad, they did well enough, but in truth they were going through the motions to ensure their master's approval. Each student had followed their own path, and was loath to stray far from it. One by one they left Puretide's side, studies as complete as time could afford. They took their new names and titles from the peak of Mount Kanji: Commander Osho, Commander Oshasera, and Monad Commander O'Case. They would go on to fight in different war zones across the Tau Empire and in different time zones. The different disciples of Puretide were all to make their mark on history. Oshova's first true command saw him reinforce the Tau population of Aranasha as they faced the Greenskins for the first time. With the Fire Caste committed in force, it was not long before the planet's oxide dunes ran red. The planet of Aranasha was settled during the second sphere of expansion. Despite the aridity of the oxide deserts that made up the surface, the Tau had settled with a sizable population, through the tireless work of the Earth Caste scientists and engineers. By their efforts, they girded the planet with two strings of biodomes that ran around the most temperate latitudes, each a mirror distance from the equator. From orbit, the world appeared as a blood-red globe in the ocean of space, banded with two rows of bioluminescent lights that pulsed bluish-white. In their investigations before the earliest expeditions to Aranasha, the Earth Caste made a disturbing discovery. Whilst determining the source of the deserts, they found a great variance in the metallic composition and even origin of the particulates. It was as if the world had been entirely covered in metal structures at some time in the distant past, which had long since been ground to dust. Given the depth of the residue, that ancient civilization must have included several artificial cities the sizes of mountain ranges. Theories abounded about the Earth's catastrophe that had torn it apart. Though the Tau had no idea what could have caused it, or who the inhabitants were, they had taken their first glimpse of the world-destroying power of the Imperium. My theory: Aranasha was subjected to exterminatus. It's not impossible that it was killed by some other means, overrun by chaos or something like that, but by this hint I would say it went under exterminatus. However, they weren't alone forever. The Orc crusade of violence known as War Dok appeared in the vicinity of Aranasha without warning or reason. The void east of the planet had been empty for years, and then one equinox, a solar storm erupted that appeared to make odd symbols in the sky. When it subsided, the Earth Caste sighted something defying all logic. The eastern void was now dotted with energy signatures, each burning off so much radiation that they could not possibly be Tau in origin, and every one was on a collision course with Aranasha. Weeks later, the planet was in the throes of war. An orc invasion of vast size had descended, The crudeness of the Orc assault had been its saving grace. The Earthcast solutions could depressurize or destroy a conventional fleet before it reached orbit, but there was nothing conventional about this armada. Even the heavy rail cannons on the biodomes had proven next to useless against the balls of rock and junk hurtling from space. More and more craft came down and crunched into the dunes in a jaw-dropping planetfall that the Tau took to calling the Gorokar, or Death Hail. Hunter and Defender cadres were scrambled, but greenskins seethed out of the impact crater around each asteroid like water overflowing a boiling pot. By the time Commander Shovah and his fleet reached Aranasha, the planet was all but overrun. With the exception of a few mobile strike forces, the Tau military presence had been destroyed in a series of disastrously one-sided engagements. The remaining populace was holed up in the biodomes. Though the Orcs had destroyed most of the connecting structures, they had not worked out a way to pierce the meters-thick carapaces of the habitats themselves. Each was an island in a sea of invaders, surrounded by barbaric greenskin hordes. The Tau inside got a good chance to study their persecutors up close, but the resources were dwindling and their military forces were pitifully inadequate. Without each biodome's dew farms bringing in the water they required, the life expectancy of Aranasha's people could be measured in weeks, and that was being really positive. To Shovah's great surprise, his counter-fleet made it to Aranasha's surface entirely unmolested. All the asteroid vessels the Orcs had used had made planetfall, with no exceptions, and no battleship picket had been left out, not even monitor stations. It was as if the invaders were too busy preying on the Tau to care about enemy reinforcements. And Shovah didn't get it. He was bewildered. He would come to know the Orc mindset all too well in future, but he had yet to understand that if the Orcs could have prevented the fleet's counter-invasion, they wouldn't have done so. He'd been briefed so he could formulate an appropriate plan of attack for the coming fight. The dust storms could be avoided with careful monitoring of the suborbital drone network. Provided he gave the Stormfronts a wide berth, there was no reason there should be any problem at all. But the Orcs were another matter. According to the aerial observations of the Aircast, there appeared to be even more of the violent alien warbands than in the first few weeks of the invasion. Stranger skill, drone scans confirmed something the Ethereals had put down to fearful rumour-mongering at first. The individual Orcs testing the defences were getting bigger. Thus far, the bestial aliens had resisted or ignored all attempts to communicate, and the Watercaster were at a loss for proceeding. All the beast seemed to want to do was fight. In his pre-battle meditations, Shovah found he could relate to that concept. He'd been practicing the art of war in simulations or languishing in the limbo of interstellar travel for far too long. In his heart, he relished the spectacle of war. It called to him. The noise, the light, even the letting of blood if he was completely honest with himself. These reflections were the first steps to Old's understanding the Orc psyche, and in achieving that, turning the tide of the Aranasha War. Though the Tau had engaged whole alien civilizations before and won, in almost all invasions, the Firecast had the upper hand. This time, however, the Tau war machine would be tested in such desperately unfavourable conditions. Training simulations often gave Tau outnumbering circumstances, about 10 to 1 sometimes. However, this time, they were outnumbered by nearly 400 to 1. Such is Orcs. When the Aircast's final observations were relayed, he nodded in acknowledgement. His contingent cadres would have to use the weapons of the mind rather than the gauntlet. Against the beast, such a strategy was inevitable. When asked to clarify his intent, Shovah drew one of the ornamental swords from the wall and stabbed it through his command throne before snapping its blade in half. The broken sword became a metaphor which became famous in the ensuing months amongst the Firecast. The initial engagements were intended to re-establish supply routes, test the greenskin defences and capabilities as a sort of side note. So individualistic were the Orcs there were no uniforms or markings of structure, so Shovah was forced to probe further into their mindset. In every corner of the world, he killed Orcs from long range to ensure their scattered mobs were on the brink of panic. Almost without exception, the largest Orc in each group had restored order. The simplicity of their structure was such that it had first been overlooked. For the Orcs, might was right, and that was it. Another observation that Shovah made was whenever his troops struck the milling Orc armies and faded, fighting would erupt even if no foe was left to engage. Stealth drones overhead confirmed this. The Orcs would take any excuse to attack one another. Leadership challenges, theft of property, even a carelessly thrown about remark would flare up into a brawl. Osho established his mobile headquarters and recordings were sent back to him. After this came a year-long period known as the Great Thinning. Farsight ordered forward stealth contingents and battlesuit teams to patrol, locating and destroying the largest orcs before disappearing without a trace, sending the remainder into a frenzy of violence as they cast around for their persecutors before turning on each other. Blood would fly as the orcs fought for command and the body count climbed. Osho watched every recording with cold fascination. Before long, he had deciphered not only the glyphs the orcs used as a writing tool, but also the orc tongue. Soon he was telling his aides what would happen before it had even happened. His officers were joking that he must have seen the recordings already, but they knew full well that he'd simply come to understand his foe. His command staff was soon referring to him by a new moniker, Shovah, Farsighted. The knowledge gleaned slowly filtered into the Firecast doctrine. Wherever the orc glyphs for a boss, mech, or dock appeared on an orc vehicle, the hunter cadres would prioritize their destruction, slowing orc response times to a crawl. Though the Tau could not form the syllables of orc speech, Osho's Earthcast allies cut audio snippets of orcish challenges and insult into the comms networks that the invaders had looted from fallen Tau. By delivering the right insults at the right time, Osho drove a wedge of dissent between every clan and tribe, sparking a series of minor wars in the process. Within a year, the green-skinned beast was chewing on its own tail. Osho's tactics distracted the orcs to such an extent that Tau were able to get food and water into the biodomes, freeing the remainder of the Aranashan Firecast to bolster their ranks. Though many Tau quietly congratulated each other on a war well done, most orcs yet lived. Throughout both the populace of Aranasha and the counter-invasion force, the Tau now universally knew their leader as Shovah. Commander Farsight had earned his name. Despite this, he wasn't happy. He knew the fight was far from over. The more organized tribes had begun looting the comms networks, and guns, and armor of the fallen Tau. Wherever a burning hulk that had once been a skimmer hung suspended above the desert on still functioning repulsors, orcs would extinguish the flames and repurpose it, fitting it with smoke-spewing engines and solid shotguns. Monitor drone recordings showed the orc caste known as mechs were having their slave races dig deep into the oxide dunes. A lot of dead grots, I would say. The Tau would never stoop to use this material, but the orcs found it extremely useful. As more and more vehicles became armoured or constructed from oxidized metal, they blended in with the desert. Accidental camouflage. Worse still, surprise attacks were becoming more frequent. The Aircast uncovered why. Those veteran orcs fighting on Aranasha since the beginning had grown skin so thick and gnarled it could protect them from the rust storms. Each time these bands allowed a storm to overtake them, a handful of greenskins were snatched up and killed, but the rest marched in relative safety in the eye of the storm, protected from the Tau that roamed the desert. When the storm broke upon a base, those elite orcs would appear from the clouds with a vicious anger, worthy of an enraged Narlock, a Tau war beast. Commander Farsight had expected resourcefulness, but he had not come to fully appreciate the advantages afforded by orcish physiology. The number of orcs was actually increasing rather than being whittled down. Shovah and the Ethereals were forced to consider the matter of orc reproduction, which, let's be honest, is a train of thought no civilized species should have to go down. Farsight's most trusted Earthcast advisor, the young genius Ovesa, believed the orcs had a fungal component to their makeup. He maintained that the spores that they continually shed were flourishing in the deserts. If his theories were to be believed, every morning the rust dunes would shiver and collapse to reveal a clutch of immature orcs, low in tech but spoiling for a fight. Word got out that the orcs' numbers were actually increasing, hitting morale like a megaton bomb. The Ethereals present insisted it was impossible to channel more resources to Aranasha. The Tau would have to overcome alone. But how could they win? They outclassed the Tau at close quarters and actually increased in number at war. Farsight was forced to abandon his program of assassinations and turn his attention to his own camp. Morale was on the brink, and if that broke, the Tau's chances were gone. In deep talks with poor O'Case, the senior Watercast envoy that accompanied the expedition to Aranasha, Farsight came to the conclusion that one of the Orcs race's primary weapons was its warlike spirit. The Orcs spent little to none of their energies on angst or paranoia, channeling everything they had into seeking battle and fighting. The armies would expend a great number of lives in pursuing the Tau wherever they would sight it, even if it meant sustaining over 90% casualties. That last 10% would still run roughshod over a hunter cadre if they were caught. Critically, the close quarters ability of the Firecast was no match for the brutal Orks. As the war ground on, and the progress graphs in Central Command took an ever more downward turn, Farsight finished what was to be his definitive work on the Greenskins. The Book of the Beast, as he called it, was circulated to every cadre Fireblade, Battlesuit Sasui, and Kroot Shaper left. The tactical acumen in its pages was astounding. It taught the Firecast to think like an Orc, to understand their language, even to fight with the fury of an Orc in battle, if necessary. Above all, it taught them their commander understood the enemy well, and that the Tau could still win. The next few years saw a transformation in the Tau approach to the war for Aranasha. No longer did the Firecast dance out of reach, engaging at close quarters only when necessary. Instead, the military machine reversed its tactics, driving teams of fire warriors and battlesuits close to blast apart the Orcs whenever they were uncovered by the Pathfinders. When the Orcs mounted a fearsome charge, the Tau would hold their ground at the ambush point, kneeling in the rust and laying down a network of supporting fire that overlapped whenever Orcs came close. Should a greenskin make it through, they would be charging into a storm of blazing light from the photon grenades. If necessary, the greenskins would then be shot at point blank or even clubbed to death with pulse rifles while they reeled from the blasts, unable to defend themselves from the vengeful Tau. It was dangerous, perhaps needlessly dangerous, but new life had been breathed into the Firecast. Many of Shovah's pupils took to the new tactic with particular zeal, the combative commander Brightsword most of all. Ambassador Poro Case ensured that footage of Brightsword and his cadre overcoming an Orc charge at close quarters was seen far and wide. Up until that point, the Tau had done little more than defend. Now they were relishing all-out attack. Shovah had put fire in the bellies of his warriors, and it was there to stay. All across the planet, battle broke out with a renewed fervour. In the maze-like canyon networks of the Aranashan equator, Shovah lured columns of rust-plated Orc vehicles into ever narrower channels, until, with a simple vehicle kill at each end of the armoured column, the Orcs were trapped and slaughtered. Scant miles away, piranhas led Dakka jets and deathcopters on a merry dance through drone-mapped canyons until the clumsy Orc pilots collapsed, colliding with the rock faces in blossoms of flame. The Kroot mercenaries feasted on a daily diet of dune Orc flesh, adapting to the environment until their skin was tough enough to withstand even a red rust storm. They roamed the sands with their pack beasts, stoically weathering the losses from rust tornadoes as they plunged into the tempest to ambush the Orc knobs inside. The vicious greenskin scouts ranging ahead of each tribe were spied upon and slain by optimized stealth teams, leaving much of the Orc army wandering directionless. Everywhere, the Book of the Beast took its toll. As the hunter cadres mastered its methods, Shovah led his armies against hordes that outnumbered them hundreds to one, and won. The progress graphs began to change. During this period of success, the people of the biodomes were extracted, moved to the natural fortress of the Highlands, away from home and its comforts, but safe enough to survive whilst the war raged on. The hunter cadres continued to thin out and eradicate, milling the Orc armies in a series of Montcar strikes that were pitilessly efficient. Then came another innovation from the Orc ranks. Though the War had by now been reduced to less than a quarter of its starting size, the deserts were infested still. Dune Orcs pushed their way out of the sands with every dawn, and the docks leading the War had an almost necromantic talent for putting warriors back together. The Orc tenacity was incredible, but the individuals known as mechs, the equivalent to the Earth caste, that robbed the Tau of their strength. Ghoul's Gorge, named for atrocities taking place there between two rival Kroot kindreds, was a vast open canyon. Battle erupted when a vast horde of Orcs sought to push through the gorge and fall upon the biodomes beyond. In their midst was a giant drill-armed walker designed to breach the transplastic shells of the biodomes, as much an idol as a weapon of war. I think this is a stomper, but it could be a gargant. Farsight had no inclination to see if this weapon would actually work. Neither would I, to be honest. He drove his teams in close, harrying the Orc column from above whilst they were bottlenecked. Plasma fire rained down, shimmering domes flickering into existence above each mob, lit by the energies cascading across their bubble-like surfaces. Even the Titan was protected by a force dome, the heavy rail rounds of Farsight's broadside teams disintegrating on impact. These are some damn good force fields. Why don't we get them in game? The ensuing battle was torturous. They could not abandon their charges in the biodomes, yet their firepower was all but useless against the bubble fields. Bright Sword mounted a close-range battlesuit attack. He and his team quickly established that the only way to circumvent the fields was to get into them, placing the Tau just where the Orcs wanted them. So began the massacre at Ghoul's Gorge, the most disastrous battle to take place in the entire war. Every time the Tau penetrated a field in order to strike, the Orcs would charge headlong, guns blazing. Close combats erupted along the length of the gorge as the cramped conditions the Tau engineered for the battle prevented them from hit-and-run tactics. Farsight himself used a daring vertical strike to immobilize the clanking driller at the heart of the horde, but he was forced to order his cadres to withdraw before their losses became untenable. He was forced to withdraw to his mobile headquarters and consider his strategy. In consultation with his Ethereals, he once more respectfully requested reinforcement from Viola. A determined assault could see the course of the entire campaign end in favour of the Tau, as the war hung in the balance. There was a lengthy silence before the Ethereals replied that a Tau ship was coming. They said no more. When the lone ship descended, Farsight and his closest advisors met it in person, atop a massive natural plateau. The silhouette of the ship bisected the pink sun for a moment before touching down. Hydraulics whispered as a large ramp opened, and the promised reinforcements came. A single Ethereal and his 2 ceremonial honor guards. Farsight did well to choke his surprise down. A single Ethereal. That's all he got. Their presence was good for morale. That's true enough, but they could hardly be counted as a concrete asset, and certainly not the auxiliary hunter cadres that he wanted. He turned to his own advisors in shock and dismay, but he didn't say anything. It was well he did, for his actions were monitored very closely indeed. The newcomer introduced himself as Ornshi, or Aunshi, I don't know which is actually correct, of Viola. He was a veteran of scores of battles, his many scars attested to that, and he carried himself with the surety of a warrior lord. Shovah bowed low when Aranasha came to him, observing the formalities customary when welcoming an Ethereal, but there was a stiffness that made him pause. He carefully and patiently explained that the Ethereal High Council upon Tau, guided by the wisdom of Almvar himself, had need of the commander elsewhere. The Ethereal calmly explained that over the next few years the Firecast were to withdraw, taking as many of the planet's colonists as they could. He would oversee the extraction personally. No more attacks, no more killing blows, only defense. The plateau they were stood on would be their fortress, and every single Tau would defend it with every iota of their being until all had evacuated. This would be done for the greater good, effective immediately. Farsight nodded at the news and bowed low in obeisance. As a secret part of his soul, however, he felt a great disquiet. How could they abandon the planet just when victory was in their grasp? Nevertheless, a senior Ethereal had spoken. A simple commander could not hope to appreciate the full scale of the High Council's plans. Over the next year, the Council's plans were enacted to the letter. Consolidating the civilian Tau into hastily constructed biodomes, he left the natural fortresses and defended them with every weapon at his disposal. He lost thousands of good soldiers, but he further whittled down the numbers of the War that had by now converged upon him. In the process, he continued to attack their command structure, prioritizing the death of mechs, docs, and nobs until no more were left. In their haste, the Orks that had circled the plateau relentlessly ground themselves into its defenses until the valleys were choked with corpses. Not one had the vision to retreat, and Farsight pitilessly exterminated any who broke through. Many of his pupils, Bright Sword most strident among them, called for revenge, proposing a final push to exterminate the aliens once and for all. But Shovah somberly shook his head. The law of the Ethereals must be observed, regardless of circumstance or opinion. The words were ashes in his mouth, but he meant them all. So it was, the Tau colonists were evacuated and the Firecast with them. Farsight stared into space as his flagship departed, watching the planet that thousands of his warriors had fought and died for recede until it was naught but a small dot amongst thousands of uncaring stars. The next year, the Firecast were back. With the exhaustive cartographic information harnessed by Farsight's drones and with the Book of the Beast to guide them, they made short work of the Orks. The war had effectively been broken on Argat Plateau, reduced to less than 100th of the size it had been when it first arrived. The Tau's cadres cleansed and reclaimed the planet in the space of less than a year, reinstalling the colonists dome by dome as the Earthcast brought the conurbations back to a functional state. Soon the planet glittered like a jewel amongst the stars once more, but Farsight was not there, for the Tau had been assailed by a new foe, the Imperium of Man. So ends the first part of Shovah's tale. Under the tutelage of Commander Puretide, he has become an almighty general and warrior, and he is one of very few individuals in the galaxy to understand the Orkish way of war. Trust me, nobody wants to. But his story is far from over. He has yet to fight his greatest battles, the ones that will see him rise to legendary and traitorous status. This video is the first part in a lore series, and Farsight's lore is incredibly rich and incredibly long. This means to get as much detail as I'm hoping for, I'm going to need at least 3 parts to do it. It may even end up being 4. So bear with me, because it may take a while to get the whole series done. But I do hope you've enjoyed the video. Make sure to leave it a like and comments down below. My name is Michael for Tactica Imperialis, and until the next time, I'll see you all again. Bye for now.